Welcome back, my dear friends, to yet another lecture on the history of English language and literature. And we are discussing the modernist literature. We have already seen the modernist poetry. And in our lecture today, we shall discuss the modernist novels. We have talked about the novel as a genre in the Victorian period. It was the most important, most flourishing genre in the Victorian times. Now, what about the modernist novel? Did the modernist novel have the same popularity as the Victorian novel? As in the Victorian times, the 20th century fiction emerged as the most prominent genre. Writers began to elaborately experiment with language and form. While the 18th and 19th century novelists focused on social concerns, on morality and religion, the 20th century novelists focused on experiments in technique or form. The novel moved away from traditional understanding and integrated many new changes. Anti-romantic and anti-Victorian attitudes were prevalent in the early part of the 20th century, and this gave impetus, a lot of energy to the modernist fiction. We see a redefinition of novel during the early part of the 20th century. The writers had a feeling that the traditional method of novel writing was insufficient to meet the requirements of the times. The 18th century and the 19th century novels focused on the society, focused on the social concerns, because people shared a common faith and common values. People shared a common faith and common values during the 18th and 19th century. But the modern novel is incoherent, which means unclear, and it has fragmented non-linear structure, and as a result of the social and political upheavals of the times, the wars and other real problems that were happening during the first part of the 20th century. The First World War had such a devastating effect on the society. It is said that the war dislocated the fabric of the society. Therefore, the writers were compelled to alter the narrative techniques to suit the changed situation. Similarly, the situations were affected by Freudian theory as well as the philosophy of thinkers like Nietzsche, God is dead, atheism. Now, some changes adopted by the writers of the modernist novel writers are the following. The writers created narratives that defied chronology, that defied clear-cut interpretations. They adopted non-linear structure in their writings. The past, the present and the future were not seen in any linear order. The chronological sequence of events and narratives became outdated. So there is no chronology, there is no sequential order. All these orders and chronology became outdated. Now the writers used techniques like stream of consciousness and interior monologue to express the workings of the mind. Now you have learned about this stream of consciousness and interior monologue in your other papers. So the writers began to use these methods like the stream of consciousness. Now in literature, stream of consciousness is a method of narration that describes happenings in the flow of thoughts in the mind of the characters, the flow of thoughts. The term was initially coined by psychologist William James in his research, The Principles of Psychology, the stream of consciousness. Now, what is stream of consciousness? It is nothing joined, which means it is something that is flowing. A river, it can be compared to a river or a stream. So, these are the metaphors by which it is naturally described, like a stream or a river. As a stream flows continuously, the inner thoughts of the individual also flows, stream of consciousness. Metaphors of stream, river, etc. are used. Now another appropriate term for this device is interior monologue, where the individual thought processes of a character associated to his or her actions are portrayed in the form of a monologue that addresses the character itself. The monologue, the character that is addressed to the self. Just as our thoughts flow unconnected and sometimes disorganized, stream of consciousness writing is often disjoint and often lacks traditional sentence structure and lacks all kinds of punctuation. So there is no order. It flows in different in an unordered manner. Some important novelists of the modern literature are Joseph Conrad, who lived from 1857 to 1924. There is James Joyce, who lived from 1888 to 1941. There is Virginia Woolf, who lived from 1882 to 1941. And another important novelist, D.S. Lawrence, who lived from 1885 to 1930. We will see all these novelists. Now we shall see Joseph Conrad. Joseph Conrad, who lived from 1857 to 1924. Joseph Conrad was the son of an exiled Polish patriot. He was born in Ukraine and was educated in Krakow. Now, he was determined to go to the sea, and he went to Marseilles in 1874 and joined the French Mercantile Marine. Now, 4 years later, he joined the British Merchant Service. By 1885, he was a Master Mariner. He received a Master Mariner certificate. He would leave the sea in 1894 after he had spent 20 years in roaming the world in sail and in steamships. Now, his experience would prove invaluable. His experience at the sea found expression in his works. Now, it is said that Conrad brought in a whiff means smell. Conrad brought in a whiff of the sea and distant lands through his novels. So Joseph Conrad, something about his personal life. Now, what are some of his novels? His first two works were based on his experience in Malaya waters, Almayer's Folly and An Outcast of the Islands. This was the first novel that was published in 1896, Almayer's Folly and An Outcast of the Islands. The Nigger of the Narcissus, which was published in 1897, it is one of his best novels. Now, it is a story of the life on board ship, remarkable for his powerful atmosphere, its sea description and his character study. Donkin is one of the best of his many vividly drawn villains. The next novel that we can remember is Lord Jim the Tale, which was published in 1900. Now, it is the greatest of his early works. It is also the story of the sea, and is one of the best studies of men whose strength falls them in a moment of crisis. So it's a story of men whose strength fails them in moments of crisis. Now, in this work, he introduces the technique of oblique narrative. Now, what is this oblique narrative? Oblique narrative is a technique of using a tale within another tale. The inner narrative is presented in the words of a fictional narrator who is presented in the outer narrative. So, oblique narrative, which consists of a tale within another tale. Heart of Darkness, which was published in 1899, Nostromo, A Tale of the Seaboard, which was published in 1904, are some of his other noteworthy novels. So, these are some of the novels of Joseph Conrad. We also can remember some of the features of the novels of Joseph Conrad. What were some of the major subjects that Joseph Conrad would deal with? Now, he sought his subjects whatever he could expect to find adventure in a usual setting. He was concerned with the response of man in the face of danger, in the face of crisis, and also to situations that will compel an individual to make a moral choice. What about his characters? Now, Joseph Conrad does not make a straightforward analysis of his characters. He would slowly present his characters in brief, or slowly will present the characters in brief, illuminating flashes, and the characters will be revealed clearly by the end of his novel. So, slowly revealing the characters in his novels. What about his view of life? The view of life of Conrad. Now, he was a contemporary of Thomas Hardy and had profound sense of the tragedy of life. He had nothing to do with the sociological problems, sociological or problem novels. His novels were free from didacticism. He presented life as sense perceived it. So, the mystery element is there. What are the techniques that Joseph Conrad used? He was the master of the traditional direct narrative method. But in the best of his works, he used oblique narrative method. We have said what is oblique narrative. So, in the best of his works, he has used oblique narrative method. The matter was presented in a conversational manner through the medium of a spectator such as Marlowe. So this oblique narrative is specific of Joseph Conrad. What was the style that he's used? His prose style is known for his full use of the musical potentialities of the language. Musical potentialities of the language. He uses a prose that is close to poetry. Now we shall talk something about James Joyce, who lived from 1882 to 1941. James Joyce. Now James Joyce was the most complex writer among the modernists. He was the son of middle class Irish parents. He aspired to be ordained as a priest in the Catholic Church, the idea which he would abandon later to become a priest. He left Ireland, he went to France. In Paris he studied medicine, and during the First World War he taught languages in Switzerland, and he returned to Paris and settled down to a literary life. A man who wanted to become a priest, he will abandon it, then later on he will settle down to a life of literature. Now we shall see some of the novels of this famous writer, novelist James Joyce. The first novel that we can remember is Dubliners, which was published in 1914. Now what is Dubliners? Dubliners is a collection of short stories that are accounts of the Irish life. The second important novel of James Joyce that we can remember, it is a famous novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which was published in 1916. Now, it is a Künstler Roman novel, Künstler Roman, meaning artist novel in English, or it is a narrative about an artist's growth to maturity. Now, it could be classified as a subcategory of Bildungsroman. We have seen what is Bildungsroman. Bildungsroman is a literary genre that focuses on the psychological and the moral growth of the protagonist from youth to adulthood. Bildungsroman. So in Bildungsroman, the character change is very important from youth to adulthood. The novel is based on his personal experiences. A portrait of the artist as a young man. It describes the growth into self-knowledge and self-determination of Stephen Dedalus, who bears a close likeness to James Joyce in his education and in his background. Now, it is in this novel that interior monologue made its first appearance in English fiction. Interior monologue is used in this particular novel. Now, one thing that we can remember about James Joyce, it is that it is he who shaped epiphany, E-P-I-P-H-A-N-Y, epiphany into a literary mode. So, he shaped epiphany into a literary mode. Now, what is epiphany? Epiphany is a particular moment when a character has a sudden insight or sudden realization that will change his understanding of himself or his comprehension of the world. So it is a particular visionary moment that will change the character. That is known as epiphany. James Joyce would publish Ulysses in 1922. He perfected the stream of consciousness technique in this particular novel, Ulysses. It is modeled on the Odyssey of Homer, but it is set in the squalor of Dublin's slums. Ulysses is remarkable for its unstructured and disjointed impressions and mental jottings. The next novel that we can remember of James Joyce is Finnegan's Wake, which was published in 1939. Finnegan's Wake. Now the work is characterized as quite incomprehensible and the most complex works of James Joyce. Now it is the study of the history of human race from its earliest beginnings as seen in the dreams of Mr. Earwicker. Now what are some of the features of James Joyce's novels? Now the subjects of James Joyce. Now James Joyce is a serious novelist who was chiefly concerned with the human relationship. So his subject is human relationship. Man in relation to himself, man in relation to society, and man in relation to the world race. Now he is a keen and subtle analyst of man's inner consciousness. So his subject is human relationship. What is the technique? He was an experimenter with the new styles and techniques. He went quite deep in his experimentations with the stream of consciousness and interior monologue. He is unparalleled among his contemporaries in the character study. his depth of penetration into human consciousness is unparalleled. So techniques that he used were stream of consciousness and interior monologue. What was the style that he used? The style of James Joyce, the style he developed from the simple straightforward writing of Dubliners to the complexity of Finnegan's Wake. We said Finnegan's Wake is a complex work, we cannot comprehend it, understand it. His interest in language and his eager experimentations are unequaled in any period. His genius is for the comic rather than the tragic view of life, and his work is full of wit and puns. Now let's talk something about D.H. Lawrence, David Herbert Lawrence, who lived from 1885 to 1930. D.H. Lawrence. Now D.H. Lawrence was the most striking figure in the literary world between the wars. Now he was the son of a miner. He was trained for a teacher certificate. He wanted to be a lecturer or teacher, and was a pupil's teacher in his village. He published his The White Peacock in 1911. He abandoned teaching. Then he became a poet, a short story writer, essayist, critic, travel writer. He was widely known for his novels. What were some of the novels of D.H. Lawrence? The first novel, as I mentioned, is The White Peacock, which was published in 1911. Now, it is a story of unhappy human relationships. It contains one of his chief themes, the conflict between man and woman. The second novel of D.H. Lawrence is The Trespasser, which was published in 1912. The third novel we can remember is Sons and Lovers, which were published in 1913. Now, it is an autobiographical novel. The novel reveals the relationship between son and mother, and many consider it as the best of his works. The Rainbow, which was published in 1915. Now this novel, The Rainbow, also treats the theme of the conflict between man and woman. So he is worried about the relation between man and woman. Woman in Love, which was published in 1921. It was a sequel to The Rainbow, the follow-up of the novel Rainbow. Aaron's Road, which was published in 1922. It is a more mature work of greater stylistic quality. Now there is Kangaroo, which was published in 1923, and The Boy in the Bush, which was published in 1924. Now in these novels, Lawrence depicts the Australian background with a striking vividness. Now he wrote these from his experience during the World War and his later visits to Australia. There is a Lady Chatterley's Lover, which was published in 1928. Lady Chatterley's Lover. Now it is a novel in which sexual experience is handled with a wealth of physical detail and uninhibited language. The novel was suppressed in the country till 1960 for the obscene language that was used. Now what were some of the features of the novels of D.H. Lawrence? The themes of the novels of D.H. Lawrence are concerned with the basic problems of human existence, man's relation with his fellow beings and man's relationship with the universe. He is more concerned with the experience of the senses than the intellectual faculties, the sensual rather than the intellectual. The most important feeling is sexual relationship, and this relationship is given a sacred tone. So he is talking more about relationship, especially sexual relationship, and he often uses obscene language as well. He is called as the prophet of the primitive instincts and passions. Prophet of the primitive instincts and passions. So he gives more importance to the heart than the head. The characters of Lawrence show resemblance to the creator, to himself. And now we shall talk something about Virginia Woolf, the last modernist novelist that we will discuss. Now Virginia Woolf was the daughter of the eminent Victorian scholar and critic Sir Leslie Stephen. So she was born into a circle where standards of culture, standards of taste and intelligence were of the highest. Now from her younger days, she developed a wide literary background and a cosmopolitan culture. She is one of the most successful practitioners of the stream of consciousness method. So she is an erudite person. Her family also was quite erudite. He grew in that culture. She rejected the linear narrative mode and the realism of the Victorian novel, and focused on the working on the mind of her characters. Focused on the working of the mind of her characters. Now, what were some of the important novels of Virginia Woolf? The first novel that we can remember is The Voyage Out, which was published in 1915. Now, this is the first novel of Virginia Woolf, The Voyage Out. Now, this novel is presented written in the conventional narrative manner. Night and Day, which was published in 1919, is a second novel. There is Jacob's Room, which was published in 1922. Now, her distinctive technique is fully used for the first time in the novel. She uses efficiently the technique of interior monologue. In 1925, she would publish Mrs. Dalloway. Now, in this work, Mrs. Dalloway, the interior monologue technique is used with greater firmness. In 1927, she would publish To the Lighthouse. Now, in this novel, it is her finest work, and in it is displayed the mastery of the technique, the stream of consciousness. 1913 she would publish The Waves. It is in this work the ultimate development of her method appears. It is a symbolic work of great poetic beauty, in which the consciousness of the 6 characters is studied in a series of interior monologues. In 1928, she would publish Orlando, a biography. Now, this novel established Orlando, a biography, established her reputation with the wider public. The work stands alone among other novels. It is different from her other novels. The novel traces from Elizabethan to modern times the life of Orlando, who not only appears as a number of different characters, but even changes his gender, even changes his sex in the middle of the story. Now, what are some of the features of the novels of Virginia Woolf? The themes of Virginia Woolf are inner and spiritual realities rather than outward material realities. Now, her characters are seen to be in search of the inner realities of life. So, the inner realities of life, they are the themes of her novels. The technique, she rejected the conventional conceptions of the novel. She invests in character presentation with the stream of consciousness method. Prior to Virginia Woolf, Dorothy Richardson and James Joyce had used this method. James Joyce was the greater exponent of this method, stream of consciousness, than Dorothy and Virginia Woolf. So, Virginia Woolf also uses this particular method, stream of consciousness. What about the characters of Virginia Woolf? Now, all the novels of Woolf deals with the characters, and she believes that novels have evolved to express the characters. Her range of characters is small. She would probe into the inner workings of the mind of the characters in her novels. So, my dear students, we have discussed the modernist novels. We said, as in the Victorian times, the novel was an important genre in the modern times as well. In the modern novels, we see especially the methods of stream of consciousness and interior monologue is employed by the different novelists, and we have discussed 4 different novelists. Please remember these novelists, the important works of these novelists, and some of the characteristics of their novels. We have talked about Joseph Conrad, we have talked about James Joyce, we have talked about D.S. Lawrence and Virginia Woolf. So, my dear students, please make a summary of this modernist novel, probably an essay. Please write in detail about these modernist novels and the different novelists which we have discussed today. Thank you for your patient listening. Please stay safe at home. Have a joyful learning. Thank you so much.